let's have a look at deductive and inductive research as well as abductive research. So there's three different ideal types again of reasoning in the social sciences. That means how we deal with, or how observations and the data built from the observations and the theoretical statements are integrated. The first and probably most intuitive approach would be so-called inductive reasoning. That is a bottom-up method where you start with observations, data, and recognition of patterns. So first you look at reality if you want to understand reality, right? And those patterns that you seem to recognize over time, those form the basis for then formulating a more general empirical law. So you come forward to systematizing the observations you make and generalize them into laws. However, this is criticized quite often, such an inductive approach. The most critical points are, where does this initial interest and focus of the observation come from? So you pick a certain thing that you observe, you pick certain aspects of that reality that you observe. You make lots of choices and we don't really know where they come from. They might come from your mental preconceptions and form something like a proto-theory, even though it's not formalized as a theory. Another critical point is how you come from this set of observations on the one hand to a general formulation of the law on the other hand. And there is no convincing way of doing that. So even if you see perfect stability of the observations, perfect pattern, that doesn't necessarily say that next time the same observation should be expected. So we will make judgments based on what we've observed in the past will be the pattern that generally governs what happens. But it's not clear how this in practice is to be done. Furthermore, these theories inductively developed can never be considered proven, because counterexamples can pop up at any time. That the sun rises every day could be an empirical law based on observation, but there could be counterexamples, like when the sun explodes, then it won't go up anymore. There's probably also nobody to observe that anymore, but you see what I mean. So the law would then still be wrong. An example of an inductive approach to the social world would be that we choose to record the crowdedness on a market square at different times of the day and try to create a set of equations that describe the expected crowd as a function of, say, seasonality. So time of day, weekday, season of the year. These equations are then, over time, a formal theory of the seasonality of crowdedness in public spaces. And you could imagine that this functions relatively well, but it doesn't really give you much of a narrative around this. It doesn't give you the reasons, and therefore, if we see any deviations from the expected patterns, we have a hard time explaining that in a meaningful way, for instance. So that's another critical point for inductive reasoning, that you don't necessarily come to explanations. Those require additional conclusions beyond the empirical patterns that you see. That's where deductive reasoning has its strength. Deductive reasoning is the exact opposite, that we start with some premise on how the social world functions. A theory that usually is, if there is a theory. These premises are then used to logically derive at a specific prediction how the observations in our study should look like. That would be the hypotheses that guide our empirical investigation. We then compare these predictions with the actual data that we've collected based on what the theory says we should observe, and either preliminarily support the theory or reject or revise the theory if the predictions were incorrect. By and by, we would then arrive at more robust theories that come ever closer to the truth. The critical points here are: where does the initial theory come from and how sound is it? Many would say it doesn't really matter where the initial theory comes from because it's only a point of departure. But then how do you revise the theory? That's also not immediately prescribed how to do that. And there's also no final foundation of truth that we could start from to arrive at our premises. If you think of little children always asking their parents, why is this, why is that, and getting ever further in the why questions. So why do birds fly? Because they have wings. Why do birds have wings? Because evolution gave them wings over time. Why did evolution give them wings over time? Because it was it was useful in their environment and they survived with higher likelihood. Why did they survive? Blah, blah, blah. So you see, you can go on and ask why questions all the time. And that is the big problem in deductive reasoning. You will never stop asking why. And at some place, you just have to shut up the why questions and say, I don't know, I don't care. It's super clear that this is true. Don't stop bugging me, right? And that's where deductive reasoning has its limits. We may just not care where the initial prediction comes from, but if we really want to know, there's no way to arrive at that. Okay, back to our example. Deductive reasoning would work on the crowd observation like that. Based on previous data, theories of leisure time, plausible arguments, we argue something. We argue that during regular working hours, crowds on market squares would be smaller than during working hours. We then collect data to test this prediction and we find that it's correct. So then this gives some more support to the theories we used to arrive at this prediction. So if you get a bit creative and look at the visualization that Bing Copilot provided for inductive, deductive, and abductive reasoning, there is something to be learned from this illustration. So we have two opposite ways of trying to arrive at general laws. One looking to the left, let's say that's the inductive logic, and one looks to the right, that's the deductive logic, and they work according to different principles. And then we have the abductive logic that seems to be in the middle. That's to some degree true. It's some sort of middle ground, but it also deviates in other ways. It's not face-shaped as the other two, it's a thing in itself. And what deviates in abductive reasoning from the other two is that it's a more pragmatic approach with less demanding goals for its inference. So we will not look for absolute truth as inductive and deductive reasoning do, but satisficing knowledge for the purposes we define. This is a sufficiently clear, sufficiently detailed and predictive explanation. So let's look at this abductive reasoning. Abductive reasoning, as I say, is a very pragmatic approach. We start with a phenomenon that is not very well understood, that's surprising or interesting. So there's been observations made before. There's a history in what we're doing, right? It's not like we're starting from a blank sheet. But we make open-ended observations regarding this phenomenon. We don't impose strong theoretical notions on it as we would in deductive reasoning. And with preliminary data and under high uncertainty, we make an educated guess to explain the phenomenon. So we have preliminary data, highly uncertain. We just make an educated guess. And we know that this is an imperfect explanation. But this can guide the next round of observations and gradually reduce the uncertainty. And then we have, again, an imperfect explanation, but we can come ever closer to some explanation. So in a sense, what falsificationalism does across lots of studies, in that we have a theory, it's proven wrong empirically, we revise, we test it again. That happens in abductive reasoning in a more micro way within a single study or a series of studies. Think again of the market square. We observe it and get the impression that crowds are smaller during working hours. So very much what deductive reasoning also found, but in a different way. We then make additional observations, systematically comparing observations during working hours and outside working hours, because that was now our initial yet imperfect explanation. And there we observed that there are also smaller crowds on rainy days. And so we add the weather to the theorizing, a lot like we added the seasonality in the inductive reasoning. So there is good opportunity for inductive and deductive additions within abductive reasoning. Critical points in abductive reasoning is how do we even scan for phenomena that we might want to study. So as I said, we start somewhere in the process already. It's not a blank sheet approach as in inductive reasoning. We can also ask, what is it that guides the early observations? Isn't that some kind of proto-theory, some implicit preconceptions, even some stereotypes that we follow? And in the end, there is no claim to truth or absolute knowledge in this approach, which you can say is the pragmatic part of it that makes it useful in many contexts, but also it isn't a method to arrive at what the other two set out to achieve, something like full truth, absolute knowledge.